Hello, higher historians, and welcome to your next issue, which is issue 5. Why did the superpowers attempt to manage the Cold War, 1962 to 1985? So this issue is going to look at why the superpowers attempt to manage the Cold War a bit more. What is the reasons for this happening? So either in your jotter or if you're typing this up on a Word document, if you want to take the heading, which is issue 5, why did the superpowers attempt to manage the Cold War? Now, to start with, let's set the scene. Now, during the 1950s and 1960s, both superpowers had greatly increased their stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Now, the power of these weapons had increased significantly, while delivery methods had also grown and improved. Now, due to economic circumstances, increasing nuclear threat and the rise of Chinese power, the USA and the Soviet Union attempted to reduce their hostilities after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, they attempt to manage the Cold War. So, we're going to investigate today and over the course of the week, depending on how you listen to this PowerPoint, why the superpowers actually attempt to manage the Cold War. Now, to start with introduction, so our starting point for this issue here is the death of Stalin in 1953. Now, the new Soviet leadership, particularly Nikita Khrushchev, began to speak of the need for peaceful coexistence with the capitalist West, and that was a total rejection of nuclear war, obviously. Now, the communist and capitalist worlds would have to exist peacefully side by side. That's what Khrushchev believed. He also is communist. He wants communism to continue in the communist world, but he believes that communism and capitalism need to learn to exist together. Now, accordingly, it made sense for both sides to try and work actively to reduce tension and the risk of war. Now, the first thaw in the Cold War, that you could say the thaw, the easing of hostility, was underway. However, despite the signs of a thaw in relation to after 1953 when Khrushchev comes to power, the period between 1956 and 1962 actually saw a series of confrontations between the superpowers. Now, first we've got the Hungarian crisis of 1956, then we've got the Berlin crisis of 1961 with the building of the Berlin Wall, and then we've got the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which all indicated the superficial nature of the thaw. Yet, as well as raising the level of tension between East and West, the growing seriousness of these confrontations caused the superpowers to rethink their strategies and how they were actually conducting the Cold War. Now, this resulting change in policy ultimately was to lead to a more permanent relaxation of tension in the 1970s, and this period is known as Taunt. And this provided a window of opportunity to attempt to reduce international tension. So although it seems after 1956 like things are going to be better when Khrushchev comes to power, there is a lot of confrontation from 1956 to 1962, in particular flashpoints in places like Berlin and the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 into the 1970s, there is this period of relaxation of tensions known as the Taunt, when the superpowers look to manage the Cold War a bit more. So issue 5, as I said, is an evaluation of the reasons why the superpowers attempted to manage the Cold War, 1962 to 1985. So your factors in this section. Firstly, what we're going to start by looking at is the dangers of military conflict as seen in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So why does that lead to the superpowers managing the Cold War? We'll look at the danger of mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. We'll look at the development of surveillance technology in terms of superpowers managing the Cold War. We'll look at the economic cost of the arms race and how this causes the superpowers to manage the Cold War, and the development of détente. Now, firstly, our first factor that we're looking at is the dangers of military conflict as seen in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that is your subheading. So it's our first factor that we are looking at. Okay, so what we're going to do today, we're going to investigate why events in Cuba led to the superpowers working together. So by the end of this part of the lesson, what you should be able to do is to describe what happened in Cuba and explain how this caused both sides to work together. Now, this is just a quick recap of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, you obviously looked at the reasons for the Cuban Missile Crisis happening. What we're looking to do here, a small task, is to provide an answer for the hens below to summarise the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you've got 6 minutes here, so you could pause the PowerPoint at this point, just to try and note down your jot if you remember. Who was involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis? When did it take place? Why did it take place? What happened? And what were the consequences of the crisis? Do you want to pause the video at this point just to complete this task quickly? Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So who was involved? If you remember, the 3 key players in this crisis were Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. We've got Fidel Castro, who was the leader of Cuba, and John F. Kennedy, leader of America. And it takes place from the 14th of October 1962 to the 28th of October 1962. Now, why does it happen? If you remember, you've already written an essay on this. It happens due to Castro's victory in Cuba, due to US foreign policy, the fact they've got missiles in Turkey, quite an aggressive foreign policy, Khrushchev's domestic position, so he's under pressure at home for a foreign policy coup. Kennedy's domestic position, ultimately he's under a lot of pressure as well due to the Bay of Pigs. Khrushchev's view of Kennedy, the fact he views Kennedy as quite weak as well. So what happened during this crisis? If you remember, ultimately the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba which are capable of reaching most major cities in the USA. Ultimately, John F. Kennedy doesn't want this to be happening, and both sides are very, very close to a nuclear war. And this map here just shows you the capability of the missiles to reach the major cities of the USA. Now, in the end, we know that it's actually resolved peacefully and the Soviets withdraw their missiles from Cuba. Now, some of the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 were, firstly, 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, so the superpowers promised not to supply nuclear technology to other countries, so they looked to manage the amount of weapons they had. Nuclear bases on Cuba were dismantled by the Soviet Union. A nuclear war was obviously avoided. In 1963, both nations signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Now, this treaty stated that neither would explode nuclear bombs during testing in the atmosphere. Cuba did remain a communist country but left America alone. US missiles were removed from Turkey in 1962. In 1963, quite significantly, a telephone hotline was set up between Moscow and Washington to avoid further crisis. So ultimately that meant that either leader could pick up the telephone and be straight in contact with their counterpart in Moscow or Washington to discuss any issues they may have. John F. Kennedy improved his reputation as world leader whilst China broke off relations with Russia, and in 1964 Khrushchev was actually forced to resign as Soviet leader. So that's some of the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you've got to think about how close both sides came to nuclear war here, and it was a real wake-up call for both of them. They realised that, wait, hold on a minute, this can't happen again. They'd seen the damage that nuclear weapons could cause. If you remember, at the end of World War II, America dropped 2 bombs on Japan, one in Nagasaki and one on Hiroshima, and the devastation had been unbelievable. So both sides saw the damage that nuclear war could do. Ultimately, Cuban Missile Crisis is a wake-up call for both sides in terms of, right, let's work together, let's make sure this doesn't happen again. Now, as I mentioned in particular, some of the main points that emerge from this crisis, the fact that a telephone hotline is set up is massive because that allows both leaders to communicate with each other directly, and you'll see there are 2 treaties actually being signed to try and limit the amount of nuclear weapons that both sides have and supplying them to other countries. So again, this shows you that they're trying to manage the Cold War a bit more here by limiting the amount of nuclear weapons that they have. So why did the Cuban crisis lead to superpowers managing the Cold War? Well, ultimately fear of another nuclear crisis erupting. So both sides were afraid of the consequences of nuclear war, and the Cuban Missile Crisis highlighted how quickly a nuclear war could actually escalate. Okay, so over to you. What you're looking to do is to use the worksheet for the first factor, which is danger of military conflict as seen in the Cuban Missile Crisis. You're looking to complete the activities there, which includes writing a paragraph on this factor. So if you want to pause the video at this point, obviously to complete this factor, you may decide that's all you want to do today and then come back tomorrow and look at the next factor. That's totally fine. Or you may want to pause and continue with this PowerPoint to look at the next factor. Okay, it's entirely up to you. Okay, so our next reason why the superpowers attempt to manage the Cold War is the danger of mutually assured destruction, also known as MAD. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the policy of MAD. So by the end of this lesson, you're looking to describe what MAD is and explain how it led both sides to manage the Cold War. Now, from 1947 to 1981, the nations built up their nuclear arms. Now, it was soon clear that both sides had built and stockpiled enough nuclear warheads that the US and USSR could wipe out each other and the rest of the world several times over. They had reached nuclear parity, or a state of equally destructive capabilities, so ultimately both sides had the ability to destroy the other. This image here shows you quite well. You've got both presidents, you've got the hotline there that they're holding, and they're sitting below a nuclear bomb saying, and now we feel safer. So the result of the arms race led to a policy known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. Now what this actually means, the definition, is it's a military theory of nuclear deterrence, holding that neither side will attack the other if both sides are guaranteed to be totally destroyed in the conflict. So the whole point in this mutually assured destruction is effectively both sides have nuclear weapons, they're never going to use them on each other, but just the fact that they both have them stops them using them on each other. It keeps both of them safe. So let's say, for example, the USA had no nuclear weapons and the Soviet Union had lots of nuclear weapons. Well, potentially the Soviet Union could wipe out America, but the fact both sides have nuclear weapons is a policy of mutually assured destruction. They both know that they could wipe each other out, so ultimately it means that both sides aren't going to attack each other. So this policy was based upon the size of the countries' respective nuclear arsenals and their unwillingness to destroy civilization. So you can see here this sums up quite well as well. Imagine you've got the USA on the left, you have the Soviet Union on the right, they've got their bombs there, and you can see they're on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. So that sums up the policy of mutually assured destruction quite well there. Now, why was mutually assured destruction necessary? Now, never before had two war nations held the potential to erase humanity. This is the first time ever in the world that both sides have had the capability of destroying humanity. Now, ironically, it was this powerful potential that guaranteed the world's safety, because neither side were going to use it on each other, because it would mean potentially the end of the world. Now, what did MAD actually state? So it virtually guaranteed no conventional war either. So eventually, conventional tactics like non-nuclear missiles, tanks and troops would run out, and the inevitable conclusion of a nuclear strike would be reached. Now, since nuclear war was deemed unacceptable by the Soviets and Americans, there was no chance of an engagement that could lead to this conclusion. So neither side would want to get involved in a war with each other, because they wouldn't want to get to the stage where they need to use nuclear weapons. So that's what keeps the Cold War cold, so to say, as well. So did MAD end the Cold War? Well, the answer to that is obviously no. Even though it guaranteed no nuclear war, MAD didn't create an atmosphere of trust. Each side was still steadily building its nuclear arsenal to remain an equal side in the MAD doctrine, so the situation still had to be managed. Now, how was MAD actually managed? Now, one example is provided in a speech in 1967 by Defence Secretary Robert McNamara. Now, he describes how the US achieved nuclear deterrence through MAD. Now, he says, "We do this by maintaining a highly reliable ability to inflict unacceptable damage upon any single aggressor or combination of aggressors at any time during the course of a strategic nuclear exchange, even after absorbing a surprise first strike." So ultimately, what we're thinking about is, why did MAD lead the superpowers to managing the Cold War? Now again, this is fear of inferiority, so to say. So even though MAD stated that no nuclear war would take place, both sides still continued to build dangerous weapons to ensure that they were equal in terms of technology and power in comparison to their enemies. So MAD means that both sides, although they're still building their nuclear weapons, they're looking to manage them and stay equal with the other side. So again, over to you. What you're looking to do is to use this part of the worksheet here to look at the danger of mutually assured destruction, to find out why does the policy of MAD lead to both superpowers trying to manage the Cold War. So again, if you want to pause the video at this point to complete this part of the worksheet. Okay, factor number 3, what we're looking at next is the development of surveillance technology and verification. So this is our next reason why the superpowers look to manage the Cold War. So what we're looking at this part of the lesson is how surveillance technology developed during the war. So we're looking to describe the surveillance technology both sides had and explain how it led the USA and USSR to managing the Cold War. Now, surveillance, firstly, what does this actually mean, and what examples of surveillance can you think of that are used today? Now, we live in a world today in the 21st century, especially through our use of smartphones and technology, that we are constantly being watched. You can see here an image of CCTV on the right, but if you think even about your smartphones, surveillance that can be carried out, it's actually quite scary, the amount of surveillance that can be carried out even through your smartphone. If you think, for example, even things like Snapchat maps, you could check where certain people are that you have as friends. So there's lots and lots of different methods of surveillance that are used today by different parties. Now, technological developments during the Cold War. So in 1981, the USA had 8,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles and the USSR 7,000. The USA had 4,000 planes capable of delivering a nuclear bomb, and the USSR had 5,000. In 1986, it's estimated that throughout the world there were 40,000 nuclear warheads, so the equivalent of 1 million Hiroshima bombs. So that's actually quite scary if you think about that in terms of how much nuclear weapons had developed. Now, American development of surveillance technology meant that nuclear weapons could actually be identified. So for example, the U-2 flight over Cuba, where Anderson photographed nuclear sites. So they actually had the capability to fly over countries to take photographs and ultimately identify if nuclear weapons were present. Now, what did this mean? Well, that meant that U-2 planes and satellites could verify Soviet claims and ensure that through the test ban treaties that they had put in place, that the Soviet Union were doing as they promised at the negotiating table. So why did the development of surveillance technology lead to the superpowers managing the Cold War? Well, ultimately this is all about fear of being caught out by the enemy. So some historians think that arms control would never have taken root if it wasn't for the ability of the sides to verify what the other was doing. So even though they're spying on each other, even though they're using surveillance on each other through things like flying over the respective countries with planes, this is all part of managing the Cold War. So they're checking that each other is sticking to the rules, is doing what they said they would do at the negotiating table. So both sides are fearful that if they don't do as they agreed, if they don't look to manage the Cold War, then there is that fear of being caught out by the enemy. So as you can see there, historians do think that this wouldn't have ever happened in terms of controlling their arms and managing the Cold War had they not had the surveillance technology there. Okay, so over to you. What you're looking to think about is surveillance now and why surveillance technology leads to both sides to managing the Cold War. So again, if you want to pause the video at this point to complete this factor on your worksheet. Okay, factor number 4 is the economic cost of the arms race. Now this is one of the biggest factors in terms of why both superpowers look to manage the Cold War. Now what we're going to look in this part of the lesson at is why the economic cost of the arms race leads to both sides managing the Cold War. So what you're looking to do is describe how much the arms race is costing both sides and explain how this caused both sides to try and manage the Cold War. So you see here a timeline of important events in the Cold War. So you could see there 1981 USSR collapses, which we'll look at when we look at the end of the Cold War. But from 1945 onwards, you could see how both sides are looking to develop bombs. So you've got their first Soviet A-bomb, first American H-bomb. Then you could see from 1960 up until 1981, you've got USA and USSR intercontinental ballistic missiles program. You've also at the top there got SALT 1 talks, SALT 2 talks, which we'll be looking at as well. So although there is talks to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons, both sides are also still producing nuclear weapons at this time as well. Okay, so the extent of the arms race. So ultimately, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, as we know about from previous issues that we've looked at as well, were both mutual defence treaties between states. Now NATO is still relevant today, it's still in place today, whereas the Warsaw Pact did end in 1991. You can see here the extent of the arms race in terms of how much both sides had at their disposal. So troops wise, NATO had 2.6 million troops, Warsaw Pact 4 million. Tanks, you can see there are 13,000 tanks for NATO, 42,500 for the Warsaw Pact. You've got artillery there, over 10,000, and then 31,500. So that's a lot of money going into the arms race there. You see there as well the nuclear stockpile and the air control, so intercontinental ballistic missiles and planes, the amount of missiles that both sides have and how this changes over the years. So you could see in particular from 1950 onwards, right up until arguably 1970, both sides are looking to increase their nuclear stockpile. Then the USA does start to lower this slightly. The USSR, as we'll find out as well, although there is agreements to try and limit nuclear weapons, USSR continues to try and catch up with the USA and actually overtakes the USA in the 1980s. But then as you can see there's a sudden drop near the end as well. So both sides are putting a lot of money into their arms. Now the cost of the arms race caused domestic tensions in both countries. Now the USA defence spend in 1981 was around about $178 billion. Now there's no specific figure quoted for the Soviet Union expenditure, but many sources have stated that this figure was higher than the USA. Now this spending led to protests against the Cold War in both countries, with calls such as peace is cheaper. There was financial issues in the USA as well. So as we know from the Vietnam War, America had spent $120 billion on trying to prop up the South Vietnamese regime, and the conflict meant that they could not afford to assign troops or money to other areas. Now as a result of the arms race and Vietnam, President Johnson not being able to fully implement the Great Society programme which he was wanting to introduce. That was a series of reforms aimed at eradicating poverty and radical injustice within the USA. Because you've got to remember in the USA at this time, this is where there's a lot of the civil rights movement going on with figures like Martin Luther King. Now its failure had resulted in a great deal of unpopularity for Johnson, and urban riots had actually broken out in 1968 due to the significant social problems that existed in the USA. There's also massive financial issues in the USSR. Now, by the 1960s, the USSR was spending 20% of its annual budget on defence. However, in the USSR, a lot of people were starving. Standards of living were very, very low due to the failing economic policies introduced by Nikita Khrushchev. Now, industry as well in the Soviet Union was very, very underdeveloped. Industrialisation had happened a century later than in the rest of Europe, and the USSR was behind the USA in terms of production and standards of working conditions. So there's massive issues in both countries at this time. Now the solutions to domestic issues here, the fact that both sides are facing massive domestic issues, is to try and work together to try and save money. Now obviously neither side wants to cut back on its nuclear weapons without making agreements with the other side. So one way to try and solve domestic issues by saving money was to limit the amount of weaponry that both sides had. So the development of anti-ballistic missile technology and cost of war led to the strategic arms limitation talks known as SALT. So SALT talks are all about trying to limit the amount of weapons both sides have. Now the SALT treaty was signed at a summit conference held in Moscow in May 1972 between Nixon, USA leader, and Brezhnev, who was now the Soviet Union leader. So that was SALT 1. Now what was SALT 1? Now SALT 1 consisted of two parts. Now the first part was an interim agreement to set a 5-year freeze on US and Soviet missile launchers at their existing levels. The USA had already deployed multiple warhead missiles, hence its readiness to concede greater numbers of launchers to the Russians. Now in warheads, the USA had a 3-1 lead in this respect as well. Part 2, obviously the anti-ballistic missile treaty, that permitted each side to 2 ABM screens, one to protect the national capital and another to protect an ICBM launch site. Now the treaty said its intention was to achieve at the earliest possible date the cessation of nuclear arms race and to take effective measures towards reductions in strategic arms, nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament, and to promote the strengthening of trust between states. So ultimately, in fancy words, the whole point of this treaty is to try and limit the amount of nuclear weapons and save both states money and allow them to work together. Now, why would each side actually sign SALT 1? Well, if you think about the advance in technology, so in 1967, President Lyndon Johnson announced that the Soviet Union had begun to construct a limited anti-ballistic missile defence system around Moscow. Now, the issue with this, if this advancement continued, then there would be a massive, vastly expensive acceleration of the arms race, which neither superpower could actually afford to do. So more importantly, development of an ABM system could allow one side to launch a first strike and then prevent the other from retaliating by shooting down incoming missiles. So this was about trying to make sure they were working together, not get too far ahead of each other, otherwise they would then try and catch up, which would cost too much money. Now SALT 1 was quite successful, so for the first time during the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union had agreed to limit the number of nuclear missiles in their arsenals. SALT 1 is considered the crowning achievement of the Nixon-Kissinger strategy of Dayton, and Kissinger was Nixon's national security advisor. Now the weakness of SALT 1 is that it hadn't imposed limits on launchers. It had imposed limits on launchers but not on what was actually being launched. So SALT 1 still had limitations, so as a result SALT 2 was then created. Now SALT 2, why was that created? Well, that was created due to the creation of MIRVs, so Maneuverable Independently Targetable Re-entry Vehicles, and intermediate missile technology. Now negotiations were long and difficult, but in June 1979 a SALT 2 treaty was signed at Vienna between President Carter, who was then the President of the USA, and Brezhnev. So you've got SALT number 2, which is passed. Now the MIRVs, as you could see here, this sums up quite well what these are all about. But again, the fact that these missiles were capable of reaching further distances and causing more damage, it leads both sides to realise this can't go on. We need to make sure we're limiting what we are producing. Now what does SALT 2 state? Strategic launchers of all kinds, including ICBMs and SLBMs, so submarine launched ballistic missiles, were limited for both sides to 2,400, with a planned further reduction of 2,250 by the early 1980s. Now, limits were also placed on the numbers of MIRV warheads which could be deployed, so up to 10 on any ICBM and up to 14 on any SLBM. And only one new ICBM and one new SLBM could be deployed by either side. Now again, SALT 2 was again quite successful, as it was another step in the right direction because it aimed at slowing down the arms race, and it was intended to last for up to 6 years, up to 1985. However, SALT 2 was never authorised by the US Senate, a requirement for all US treaties, in response to the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan at the end of 1979. So although SALT 2 is signed, it's never actually authorised by the US Senate, so it never becomes an official treaty. However, although never formally completed, both sides actually followed the provisions of SALT 2 for a number of years as well. Now another reason why the superpowers wanted to manage the Cold War was because of Star Wars. Now this is the Strategic Defence Initiative. Now this was a programme initiated under President Reagan in 1983. Now the aim of Star Wars was to develop a sophisticated anti-ballistic missile system in order to prevent missile attacks from other countries. Now, with the tension of the Cold War looming overhead, Star Wars was the United States' response to possible nuclear attacks. The results of that was there were concerns that the programme breached SALT II, and for this reason, in conjunction with financial limitations, Star Wars was abandoned. But the whole point in the Star Wars programme was meant to be, as you can see with this picture, it was meant to be a system where the USA could actually shoot down missiles from space, but it was going to be a very, very costly programme as well. Eventually it is abandoned. And again, you can see here, this is a cartoon summarising the issues with Star Wars and how much it would actually cost the USA. So, ultimately, when we're talking about economic costs, so why did the cost of the arms race lead the superpowers to managing the Cold War? Well, there's actually fear of revolution at home and fear of bankruptcy at home. So Brezhnev's desire for better relations was in part about freeing up resources for economic development in the USSR. So he wants to work with the USA so he has more money to spend at home. And he hoped this would show the superiority of the Soviet system by being able to develop the USSR at home. Nixon was very worried about the increasing number of Soviet warheads, and due to the unpopularity of the Vietnam War, heavy increased defence expenditure could be difficult, so it might not be well received by American voters. So again, he would want to spend more money at home helping the people. Okay, so over to you. As I said, this is quite a big factor, but this worksheet here again will summarise what we just discussed, and you're thinking about the economic cost of the arms race. So again, if you read over the worksheet and complete the activities to go with this, think about why the cost of the arms race leads both sides to managing the Cold War. Okay, and the very last factor that we're looking at in this section is the development of Taunt. Now what we're going to look at is the development of Taunt. So by the end of the lesson you should be able to describe what Taunt was and what it involved, and explain how it led to both sides cooperating as part of the Cold War. Now what is Taunt? Now Taunt is just the easing of hostilities or straightened relations, especially between countries. So that's what Taunt means. It's all about the easing of hostility or strained relations between countries. Now, peaceful coexistence. Now the term was first used by Khrushchev when he came to power in the Soviet Union in the 1950s. Now Khrushchev probably accepted that the USA and the USSR's ways were different, but he felt that ultimately each side's got their own sphere of influence that the other should not get involved in, and it's about living and working together. However, Khrushchev's other policies, in particular him placing missiles in Cuba leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis, seemed to mean that he was as aggressive as any other Soviet leader. And so Khrushchev's apparent promises of peaceful coexistence were actually never really taken seriously in the USA. However, due to the Cuban Missile Crisis, as we know, by the 1970s there was direct communication between the superpowers, and the leaders actually visited each other's countries. Now in addition, negotiation had proved possible over several nuclear treaties, as we've just discussed, treaties like SALT I. Now all this proved that the USA and the USSR could live and work together without provoking each other. So you have a policy of détente. Now as I've said there, it refers to the time in the 1960s and 1970s when the two superpowers eased tensions and tried to cooperate during the Cold War to try and avoid conflict. Now détente helped the superpowers reduce spending on the arms race and fighting the Cold War. Instead they could focus on problems in their own countries at home. So why did détente actually occur? So when we're thinking about why détente occurred, if you look at these images here, these will help you to think about why détente actually occurs. So firstly, cost. So building nuclear weapons was expensive, so both countries needed to spend money at home on domestic issues instead of on nuclear weapons. The USSR also had no allies, so the USSR had fallen out with communist China, and it would be in our best interest to have a better relationship with America. The threat of nuclear war was also a big reason, so both countries realised that their arguments had brought the world close to nuclear war several times, in particular in Cuba. Overkill, so both sides had enough weapons to destroy each other and the world several times over, so why do we need more nuclear weapons? Nuclear proliferation, so more countries were building nuclear weapons, so countries like India, Italy and China, and this worried the USSR and USA that there would be more chance of a nuclear war, so they need to try and work together to solve this. And protests, so in the 1960s more and more people were protesting about nuclear weapons in the USSR and in the USA, so the government simply could not ignore these protesters, they had to take some form of action. So détente in action. Now this just shows you some of the agreements that were made between both sides, some which we've already discussed as well. So there you've got their 1963 Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, then 1967 Outer Space Treaty, 1968 Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, 1971 Seabed Treaty, 1972 SALT I, 1975 the Helsinki Agreement, and 1979 SALT II. Now in particular the ones that we've highlighted there, Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, SOT 1 and SOT 2 are all about reducing nuclear weapons. So you can see here, this is the Taunt in action. This is both sides looking to work together to try and reduce the amount of nuclear weapons. You've also got the Taunt taking place elsewhere in Europe through a policy known as Ostpolitic. So this was led in the late 1960s and early 1970s by the Foreign Minister Willy Brandt. Now, ultimately, efforts to improve East and West relations in Europe had taken place in West Germany. So the development of Ostpolitik, which was a policy towards the East, this was developed by Willy Brandt, who was the Foreign Minister in West Germany. So he wanted to try and develop a better relationship with East Germany. Now, Brandt had been the mayor of West Berlin at the time of the Berlin crisis, so he knew better than anyone the bitterness of the division of Germany. However, he was a realist, so reunification in the present political climate was impossible. However, he felt that much could be done to improve relations between West Germany and Eastern Europe and the USSR, so he wanted to improve relations. Now, he offered to recognise the frontiers of Poland and Czechoslovakia as permanent as a first step towards improving relations, and moreover he declared his support for any moves to reduce arms levels in Europe. And here's some of the things that he did. So you can see here, 1967, West Germany and Romania established diplomatic relations. Remember, Romania was in Eastern Europe at this time, so it was a communist country. He opened a trade mission in Czechoslovakia. A ban was lifted on the West German Communist Party. Brandt visited the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. In August 1970, a non-aggression treaty was agreed between West Germany and the USSR. In December 1970, a non-aggression treaty was agreed between Poland and West Germany. And in December 1972, a treaty between the German Democratic Republic and the Federal Republic covering trade and cultural links was agreed, leading to major improvement in relations. So you've got this real effort in Europe at Dayton to try and make a difference. Again, you can see some of the other events here which take place during the policy of the Taunt. So you've got there, for example, President Nixon visiting Washington, President Nixon visiting Moscow, and Brezhnev visiting Washington. So both sides are really looking to work together here to try and make sure that relations are eased and improved. The Taunt in Europe Part 2, we've also got the Helsinki Conference, which takes place 1972 to 1979. So due to the success of Brandt's Ostpolitik, the situation in Europe had improved greatly. Now, the USSR was developing greater economic links, including the natural gas pipeline from Russia to the West. Now, it's felt at this time that ultimately now was the time for better discussions between Europe to try and reduce tensions. Now, in July 1972, the first round of talks opened in Helsinki in Finland, and ultimately the conference came to an end in August 1975 with the Helsinki Final Act. And this was a 30,000 word document signed by 33 European countries and the USA and Canada. Now, this was more a statement of aims and intentions rather than a treaty. Now, the Final Act consisted of 4 headings known as baskets. So what they looked to do, so the signatures pledged to recognise Europe's borders and to refrain from interference in other countries. It dealt with the fields of economics, science, technology and the environment, so trade agreements were encouraged. It dealt with cooperation in humanitarian and cultural fields such as freedom of movement, and it provided a follow-up conference in Belgrade. So this is all about countries trying to work together. So though it's not an official treaty, it's more agreements that are being made to try and make sure that the Taunt takes place in Europe. Now, there were some limitations of the Taunt. Now, although the conclusion of SOT 1 and the Helsinki Final Act seemed to be significant progress, the second half of the 1970s had saw a steady slackening of the pace of the Taunt, and there were several factors involved in this happening. So why did the Taunt start to fail a bit in 1979? So there was suspicion, so neither side would actually allow in nuclear weapon inspectors to monitor the amount of weapons they had, so that caused suspicions to grow. You've got 1973, the Arab-Israeli War, so the SSR and USA helped to support different sides, so the USSR support the Arabs and the USA support the Israelis in this war. You've got the failure of the Helsinki Agreement, so the USSR promised at Helsinki to provide basic human rights. Chapter 77 was a group formed to investigate whether this was carried out, and they found that human rights were still being denied in USSR. And communism, so in 1979 the USSR sent troops to restore order and put a loyal communist government in Afghanistan. So that's another reason why the Taunt starts to fail. So why did policies of coexistence and Taunt lead the superpowers to imagine the Cold War? Ultimately, the Taunt is all about easing fear and promoting peace and security. So both sides looked to have peaceful coexistence. So both sides accepted that even though policies and beliefs were different, they could work peacefully alongside each other. Even though it failed at times, like in Cuba, negotiations did become possible. And the Taunt, ultimately where both sides could breathe a sigh of relief as the cost of arms race decreased and more resources were available to tackle domestic issues. So over to you. The last factor that you're looking to discuss is the taunt. So you're thinking about why does the taunt happen, what does it actually mean, and what was the taunt like in action, thinking about how this led both superpowers to manage the Cold War. Okay, so what you're going to upload via Teams from this lesson is just your notes and paragraphs for each of the factors that we've covered. If you have any questions about anything discussed in this lesson, then please just let myself or Mrs. Forty know. Thank you very much.